Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, 4 weeks of famous philosophers. In this video we're going to be looking at Ludwig Wittgenstein, father of the Vienna Circle, deriver of the linguistic turn, and greatest philosopher of the 20th century. Now, Wittgenstein is considered by many to be the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and there might be some debate, but he's probably at least up there as number 1 or 2, and by some to be the greatest mind since Immanuel Kant. Along with More and Russell, he was one of the founders of analytic philosophy. He only ever published one book during his life. Book in the sense he published a children's dictionary and one other article, but a book as we would consider a book that you might read on philosophy, where he claimed to solve all of the problems of philosophy. He made significant contributions to logic, and particularly the philosophy of language, which are still relevant today. And those contributions in the philosophy of language had far-reaching impacts on many of the other areas of philosophy. Born in 1889 in Vienna to a wealthy family, Wittgenstein originally pursued an education in engineering, but was led by an interest in pure mathematics to meet and work with Gottlob Frege, who recommended that he go to Cambridge and study logic with Bertrand Russell, who was wary of him at first, but eventually took him on as a protege, claiming that Wittgenstein might solve some of the puzzles that Russell was too old to, even though Russell ended up outliving Wittgenstein by 13 years. Russell lived for a really long time. He only spent 2 years at Cambridge before isolating himself in Norway until World War I. He fought in the war and was eventually imprisoned near the tail end. During the war, he worked on the only book he would publish in his lifetime, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which was published after the war. In this book, Wittgenstein claimed to have solved all of the problems of philosophy, and therefore he looked to other pursuits, such as gardening, architecture, teaching, and would later work as a hospital porter during World War II. He gave his inheritance away to his siblings. 3 of his brothers actually ended up committing suicide. Wittgenstein himself considered suicide. And after around a decade out of academia, he returned to Cambridge, having discussed some of his ideas with the Vienna Circle, which held his work as a fantastic piece of work that would push forward their logical positivist ideals. And he developed new ideas at this point, which would later be published posthumously in Philosophical Investigations and other works. He died of prostate cancer in 1951. In his first book, Tractatus, Wittgenstein claims to solve all of the problems of philosophy through the philosophy of language. This linguistic turn towards language, represented a major shift in philosophical thought at the time. It is made through the claim that the most basic elements of the world are not objects, but rather facts or states of affairs. Propositions and thoughts are just pictures in one's head. These pictures are made true by corresponding to facts. The elements or parts of a picture or a proposition each correspond isomorphically to the objects in the fact or state of affairs. And the relations in the proposition or the arrangement of those elements in the picture in your head correspond to the way that the state of affairs is arranged. For more on this, check out my video on the correspondence theory of truth. Wittgenstein also divides language into 3 general categories. Propositions or pictures that have sense, propositions or pictures that lack sense, and nonsense. If a proposition does not have some fact or picture of the world that it corresponds to, some state of affairs that picture in your head maps onto isomorphically, then it lacks sense or is nonsense. Wittgenstein's statements of logic lack sense, and they're only given truth values by convention or just as a sign. Propositions about ethics, aesthetics, and anything else which does not have a clear fact in the world which it corresponds to are meaningless. They're just as meaningless as the statement Russell is identical. This goes for mathematical claims like 5 is a number, and even metaphysical claims like objects exist. Basically, Wittgenstein said that it was nonsense to even try to talk about these things, relegating much of philosophy to the garbage. Instead of these pursuits, philosophers should engage in critiques of language and clarifications of thoughts. You can see how this led to some of the foundations of analytic philosophy as we understand it today. Philosophy should not be perceived as much as a doctrine, so much as an activity to be engaged in. And this idea of getting rid of the doctrine of philosophy and moving it towards a different kind of pursuit is one of the few things that holds true as a thread throughout a lot of Wittgenstein's work. He's often divided into the early Wittgenstein and the later Wittgenstein. The early Wittgenstein can be found in Tractatus, the later Wittgenstein in Philosophical Investigations and the other papers published there. But in both, he has kind of a rejection of this idea of philosophy as a doctrine. Since much of Tractatus, though, is statements which are now declared to be nonsense, there's a bit of a contradiction or tension in Wittgenstein's work, because he's basically taken all these statements about metaphysics and then said all statements about metaphysics are nonsense. So he claims that this work is a ladder which we must use to see the world, but after doing so, we have to get rid of the ladder, since we've learned that that ladder itself is meaningless. There are many different conflicting interpretations of those statements and this book, including Russell's interpretation in the preface, which Wittgenstein actually disagreed with. The Tractatus is very, very logically laid out. It separates his ideas into propositions that are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and explanations of each of those as 1.1, and an explanation of 1.1 is 1.11, and so on and so forth. It is very logically and methodically laid out. Philosophical Investigations, on the other hand, was Wittgenstein's second most famous book and was published posthumously along with much of his later work. It represents a very different perspective that Wittgenstein developed later in life after publishing Tractatus, living his life, going off being a gardener, an architect, and all these things, and coming back. It reconceives of philosophy of language as a therapy, or philosophy in general as a therapy, rather, instead of a critique. He claimed that language was actually a set of games that followed particular rules. Meanings of words are dependent on their use, and the language games that they are being used in. In other words, given different contexts or different games, a single word or even a same proposition might have different uses and therefore mean different things. Language games include things like telling a joke, making up a story, or making up and testing a hypothesis. The same sentence could have very different meanings if it was told in a joke, if it was told in a story, or if it was told to be posited as a hypothesis and then tested. In one, we might laugh at it, in another, we might imagine it, and in a third, we might test it and work with it and fight to see if it's true. What determines the rules of these games and the use of these words is a common shared experience of those words and those rules of the games. Grammar is not so much an external system of rules that is separate from our experience of language, but rather a shared set of norms and agreements about how we play a language game. He preferred the concept of family resemblance when talking about the meanings of words, as opposed to the traditional kind of philosophical necessary and sufficient conditions for X being a Y. This idea of kind of no private language is best illustrated in Wittgenstein's famous thought experiment involving a beetle. Imagine everyone has a box, and inside that box they have something they call a beetle. No one can see anyone else's beetle, but they can talk meaningfully about beetles and use the word. The point is that the meaning of beetle is not dependent on what is actually in anyone's box. It is dependent on how we use it. In other words, even if I see the background of this video as the color that you might call green, if you popped into my head, were able to see it, you'd be like, oh, I would call that green. It doesn't mean that I'm mistaken when I call it red, since a number of other people would call it red. So the meaning of the word red doesn't depend on what I see in my head, but rather the public use of the word. Therefore, our rules and our meanings are not defined by the things that are in our head, but rather our use of them around other people. Therefore, I give you Ludwig Wittgenstein, father of the Vienna Circle, driver of the linguistic turn, and greatest philosopher of the 20th century. Next up, we're going to be looking at Karl Popper. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.